Hey everyone, today I'm going to make this jewelry cabinet out of cherry wood and ambrosia maple. I'll start by cutting the cherry and the maple to its rough length. I'm going to use the cherry for the carcass of this, and the maple will be the panel for the front door. The joiner allows me to get one straight edge on each piece. Here I'm planing all the cherry wood for this project down to 5/8 of an inch thick. Next I can cut all the pieces to their final length and rip all of the boards to their final width as well. Cherry's prone for some burning at the table saw, so I'll use my hand plane just to clean up the sides, get all the burn marks off. To start laying out for dovetails, I'll use the thickness of the pin boards to mark out my tail boards. I'll scribe a line on all four sides of my tail board with my marking gauge. After clamping both boards in the vise, I can start laying out my tails. I mark the waist portions so that I make sure that I cut on the correct side of the line. I mark out the angle of the tails using a homemade dovetail gauge. Now I can use my dovetail saw or small rip saw to start cutting the tails out. I want to make sure that I don't cut past the lines that I scribed in the board at the beginning. I'll chisel up to my scribed line on the sides to make a trough for the saw to rest in. And I can cut out the waist between the tails with my coping saw, again making sure not to go past the line I scribed. Now I'll use my chisel to take out the rest of the waist. To get the cleanest lines, I'll chop down halfway on the back, then flip the board over and chop the other half out. The outside shoulders should be pretty close. I'm just scraping off the saw marks. Here I'm creating a shallow ledge on the inside of the tail boards. The ledge is going to go all the way up to the line that I scribed at the beginning. The ledge is going to help me register the side boards against the bottom and top when I go to mark out the pins of the dovetails. After scribing the thickness of my tail board onto the pin board, I'm ready to start setting up to mark out the pins. This is where the shallow ledge I created earlier helps me to align the two boards. I'm using a long thin marking knife to transfer the shape of the tails onto the pin board. Then I come back with a pencil and fill in the lines and also mark out the waist. Now making sure I saw on the waist side of the line, I'm ready to start cutting out the pins. It's been a while since I cut dovetails, so I made a few practice cuts on a scrap board before making these critical cuts on a pin board. Now I can go back to my coping saw to cut out the waist of the pins. And just like on the tail boards, I use my chisel to cut to the line. After cleaning up all the crumbs and stuff on the inside corners, I'm ready to test fit the pin board and tail board together. Now that I'm done with the dovetails, I can start marking out for the divider that'll go in the cabinet. Using my table saw and sled, I create the dados in the sideboards. I'll clean up and fine-tune the grooves using my small router plane. After a quick test fit, just to make sure everything goes together right, I'm ready to start gluing up this cabinet. After the glue's dried, I take my hand plane and start cleaning up the dovetails and the case sides. It can be challenging to hold the workpiece still, so I use this scrap board clamped to my workbench and let the workpiece straddle it. Here I'm creating a 1/4 inch rabbet in the back of the case to accept the backing board. Next thing I'll do is glue in the divider. I'll clamp it up and let the glue dry while I start working on the door. I start the door by cutting a small groove in the rails and the stile. The groove's ultimately going to accept the panel and the tenons on the rails. To make sure the groove is centered, I make one pass over the blade, then I take the board and flip it so the other face is up against the fence, and then make one more pass. After I've cut the grooves in all 4 pieces, I'm ready to start creating the tenons. I set the saw blade up so that it cuts right up to the start of the groove, and that should set the thickness of the tenon pretty well. I usually leave my tenons a little thick at the table saw so that I can use my hand plane to fine tune them and get a tight fit into the groove of the stiles. Then I clean the edges up with a chisel. Since the maple panel door needs to be wider than what my 6-inch joiner can handle, I'll use a hand plane to flatten one face of the board. I'm using a low angle plane since the maple has a lot of figure to it and I don't want to have any tear out. After a few passes with the hand plane, I'll flip the board over onto the workbench, which I know is pretty flat, and check for any kind of wobble. Now I'm able to send the board through the planer to clean up the other face. Finally, I'll square it up at the table saw. To be able to resaw this board to the thickness that I want, I'll start by marking the line out that I want to cut to. Then I can use my bandsaw to cut the board into 2 pieces. Here I'm cutting the panel to its final length and width. Now I can clean up the resawn face of this board with my low angle plane. To fit the panel to the grooves, I'm going to create a rabbet using the table saw on all 4 sides, and then I will clean up the rabbet and fine tune the fit using a shoulder plane and a block plane. I like to use my shoulder plane for this operation because it helps me sneak up on the fit, and I just enjoy using hand tools. The router bit leaves the corners of the rabbet rounded, so I'm using a chisel to square everything up. I'm applying a wipe-on polyurethane finish to the panel before I insert it into the frame and glue it all up. I'm also going to start applying a couple coats of polyurethane to the inside and outside of the case. Once the finish has had some time to dry, I'm ready to glue the panel into the frame. I'll clamp the door up and let it sit overnight. Here I'm using a hand plane to clean up and touch up any high spots on the frame. The hand plane leaves a pretty good finish, so all I need to do is touch it up with my random orbital sander and some 220 grit paper. So normally the case doesn't come out perfectly square or the door doesn't come out perfectly square, so I'll use my hand plane and go ahead and trim off the sides a little bit and match the door up to the frame to get a good fit. I'll touch the sides up with some 220 grit paper as well. I want to create a recess in the door to use as a pull handle, so I'll bury a cove bit into my router fence and make a cut across it. Here I'm starting to chisel out the mortise for the hinges. I'll transfer the marks from the case over to the door and chisel away those mortises as well. Now I can go ahead and drill some pilot holes and install the hinges to the door and the frame. For the back of the cabinet, I'm gluing in a 1/4 inch piece of cherry plywood. The glue should hold it no problem, but I'm going to go ahead and throw a couple pin nails in anyways. I'm using a small strip of cherry wood and some buttons I picked up at a craft store to make a shelf to hang the necklaces from. I attached the strip to the backboard using a couple of wood screws. After applying a couple more coats of polyurethane and then a wax, here's the finished cabinet. If you If you enjoyed this build, watch some of my other videos and make sure to subscribe.